March 12, 1943, Portland, Oregon. The Office of Price Administration building on Southwest Morrison Street. 27-year-old food inspector Margaret Hendricks holds test report number 47-OPA-43 in her hands and cannot believe what she's seeing. The analysis of canned salmon from the batch delivered to Jefferson Elementary School shows bacterial contamination levels 14 times the acceptable standard. 14 times. This isn't equipment malfunction. This isn't statistical error. This is deliberate poisoning of children with product that should have been condemned at the cannery. The label reads, __quote_0__. Margaret has worked as a federal food inspector for 3 years now. Before that, 4 years at Oregon State studying food science, then placement with the OPA when the war started, marriage to Howard, an apartment on Burnside Street. Howard working as a shift supervisor at the shipyards, building Liberty ships for the war effort. An ordinary American life for a 27-year-old woman born in February 1916. But Margaret has one particular trait that only her closest friends know about. She cannot abide injustice. Not in an emotional, hysterical way, in the sense that she is physically incapable of leaving wrongs unaddressed. When a teacher in high school unfairly failed a classmate, Margaret filed a formal complaint with the superintendent. When a college professor openly demanded payment for passing grades, Margaret went to the dean with evidence. The professor was dismissed. Margaret's classmates shunned her for a semester, but she slept soundly at night. Now it's March 1943, and Margaret understands this isn't an isolated quality control failure. She pulls the archive records for the past 8 months and discovers a pattern that makes her blood run cold. Columbia River Cannery delivers product to schools and institutions in 3 categories. First, cans with expiration dates approaching, relabeled with false dates. Second, cans stored improperly, allowing bacterial growth in supposedly shelf-stable food. Third, and this is the worst, cans filled with fish that was already spoiling on the fishing boats, then saved through aggressive thermal processing and sealing. Technically, such product passes documentation as acceptable, but in reality, it's a biological time bomb. Margaret creates a spreadsheet. From July 1942 through March 1943, Columbia River Cannery delivered to 11 elementary schools and 3 high schools across Portland, a total mass of 10,500 pounds of canned salmon and tuna. From her spot check inspections, Margaret can only test what her limited OPA budget allows. 68% of samples show violations. Extrapolation yields a horrifying figure. Over 7,000 pounds of potentially hazardous product consumed by children aged 6 through 17. She goes to her supervisor, Regional Director Edmund Carlisle, a 53-year-old man who's been with government food inspection since the Depression. Carlisle carefully reviews Margaret's protocols, charts, and projections. 3 minutes of silence. Then, __quote_2__ Margaret objects, __quote_3__. Carlisle gives her a long, measuring look. Margaret understands. But she has no intention of backing down. That evening, Margaret sits in their apartment kitchen. Howard eats dinner, talks about the shipyard, about a new welding technique they're implementing. Margaret stays silent, staring at her plate. Howard notices. "Maggie, what's wrong? You've barely said 2 words tonight." Margaret looks up. "Howard, if you knew someone at the shipyard was stealing materials and management was covering it up, what would you do?" Howard shrugs. "I'd report it to the appropriate authorities." "Why?" Margaret shakes her head. "What if the appropriate authorities were part of it?" Howard laughs. "Maggie, have you been reading too many detective novels? Don't work yourself up. We're America. We have rules." Margaret doesn't argue, but she knows. They have rules. They just don't always apply to men like Vernon Bradshaw. March 18, 1943. Margaret Hendricks files a formal complaint with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Oregon. 14 pages of documentation with attached laboratory reports, statistical tables, and calculations. Core allegation. Columbia River Cannery plant manager Vernon L. Bradshaw orchestrated systematic delivery of contaminated product to schools while simultaneously diverting quality product through black market channels. Potential charges: fraud against the United States, violation of wartime rationing regulations, reckless endangerment of minors. Margaret requests criminal investigation. She hands the file to a secretary at the federal building, a middle-aged woman with a disinterested expression. The secretary accepts the folder, stamps it received, issues a receipt. __quote _10__, she says mechanically. Margaret walks out of the building with the sensation of having thrown a stone into a swamp. A splash, then silence. She's not wrong. The response arrives 22 days later, April 9, 1943. Brief, a single page. Investigation of complaint filed by Mrs. M. Hendricks, dated March 18, 43, has concluded. Quality control lapses at Columbia River Cannery were isolated incidents and have been addressed by facility management. No direct causal connection established between product quality and documented illness among minors. Insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. Case closed. Signature: Assistant U.S. Attorney Wallace K. Garrison. Margaret reads the response 3 times. Isolated incidents. No connection established. Insufficient evidence. She understands. She's been dismissed with bureaucratic boilerplate. One phone call from someone at the War Production Board to someone at Justice, and her 14 pages of evidence became irrelevant. Bradshaw really is untouchable. She calls the U.S. Attorney's Office, requests clarification. They connect her to a junior prosecutor, a young man with a tired voice. Mrs. Hendricks, he says, the investigation has concluded. No violations were substantiated. If you have additional evidence, you may submit a supplemental filing. Margaret: I have 14 pages of evidence. Laboratory tests, statistical analysis, documented contamination. The prosecutor sighs. Mrs. Hendricks, I understand your frustration, but the decision has been made. Good day. Click. Margaret sets down the phone. Her hands are shaking. She understands. The system is stronger than she is. Bradshaw is protected. And she's just one inspector without connections, without leverage, without power. An ordinary OPA employee who can be crushed with a single phone call. The next day, April 10th, Margaret is summoned to Carlisle's office. The conversation is brief and unpleasant. Mrs. Hendricks, you exceeded your authority. You had no right to file federal complaints using OPA resources without my authorization. I'm issuing a formal reprimand and transferring you to a different district. Margaret tries to object. Mr. Carlisle, I filed as a private citizen, not as an OPA employee. Carlisle shakes his head. Don't play word games with me. You used government test results. Effective April 15th, you're transferred to the Gresham District Office. You'll receive your new assignment. Margaret leaves Carlisle's office feeling like the ground has been pulled from under her feet. Transfer to Gresham isn't just a job relocation, it's public humiliation. Everyone will understand. Hendricks stepped out of line, got slapped down. Now she sits quietly in a corner. Her colleagues look at her with pity and fear. Pity because they feel sorry for her. Fear because tomorrow it could be any of them. Gresham is outer Portland, agricultural area, migrant worker camps. No prestigious schools, no institutions that would intersect with Columbia River Cannery operations. It's exile. Soft but obvious. The message? Shut up and do your work in your little corner. Margaret accepts the transfer. Doesn't argue. Doesn't file grievances. She simply takes her new assignment and on April 15, 1943, reports to the Gresham District Office. New desk, new colleagues, new supervisor. Agnes Crowley, a woman approaching retirement, who makes it clear from day one. I know where you came from and why. Here, You work quietly. No initiative. Margaret works quietly. She inspects farm stand produce, worker camp kitchens, small grocery stores. Files reports. But in the evenings, at home, she continues gathering information. She understands. Bradshaw can't be taken down through frontal assault. She needs evidence so overwhelming it cannot be ignored. And she needs a channel that bypasses both the U.S. Attorney's Office and the War Production Board. May 1943. Margaret begins systematizing what she knows. Evenings after work, she fills a composition notebook. Left column, dates of salmon deliveries to schools. Right column, dates of mass illness among students. The correlations are ironclad. After each delivery of canned fish from Columbia River Cannery, within 2 to 3 days, a wave of gastrointestinal illness begins. School nurses attribute it to flu, to seasonal bugs, to anything. But Margaret sees the pattern. She understands. She needs to speak with parents. Official medical channels stay silent, but parents remember everything. Margaret starts calling acquaintances whose children attend schools that received Bradshaw's product. She asks carefully, casually, __, quote _20 __. The responses are identical. __, quote _20 __. Margaret records every conversation. By the end of May, she has 27 parent testimonies. Not enough for court, but enough to confirm. The scale of the catastrophe is enormous. June 1943. Margaret drives to Jefferson Elementary School, the one where her investigation started. She speaks with the school nurse, Dorothy Brennan, a 48-year-old woman who's worked there since 1925. The nurse is exhausted from children getting sick while she can do nothing. Margaret speaks directly. Mrs. Brennan, I know this isn't flu. It's the fish, the canned salmon from Columbia River Cannery. The nurse flinches. How do you know? Margaret, I'm an OPA food inspector. I tested those cans. They're contaminated. The nurse is silent for a moment, then says quietly, I wrote to the principal 3 times. Told her, after salmon lunch days, the children suffer. She says the product has USDA certification. There can be no problem. What can I do? I'm a nurse, not a federal agent. Margaret asks, can you show me the health logs? Just let me look. The nurse is afraid. Mrs. Hendricks, I'll be fired. Margaret, I won't mention your name. Just 5 minutes. The nurse hesitates, then decides, all right, but quickly. She leaves the logs on the desk and steps out for a cigarette break. Margaret quickly pulls out her Kodak Brownie camera, photographs pages. 28 exposures. With trembling hands, she returns the logs to their place. The nurse returns, looks at Margaret. Will you do something? Margaret nods. I'll try. At home, Margaret develops the film in her bathroom darkroom, studies the records. The statistics are damning. From January through April, Jefferson Elementary logged 127 cases of gastrointestinal illness with a student population of 240. That's 52.9%. More than half. And the spike always comes the day after fish is served. January 14th, salmon lunch. January 15th to 16th, 23 cases of diarrhea and vomiting. February 11th, salmon lunch. February 12th to 13th, 19 cases. The pattern is mathematically precise. Margaret drives to Lincoln Elementary, repeats the procedure. The nurse there is younger, 34, but equally exhausted. Margaret explains the situation. The nurse hands over the logs without questions. __, quote _32 __. Margaret photographs another 32 pages, returns home, develops, studies. Same pattern. June 3rd, tuna lunch, June 4th to 5th, Wave of illness. March 19th, salmon lunch. March 20th to 21st, another wave. By the end of June, Margaret has documented evidence from 5 different schools. Total, 412 cases of food poisoning correlating directly with consumption of Columbia River Cannery product. This is no longer statistical correlation. This is causation. But the question remains, where to take this evidence? The U.S. Attorney's Office already dismissed her. The OPA transferred her to Gresham. The War Production Board protects Bradshaw because his cannery meets military supply quotas. Every official channel is blocked. Margaret considers her options. She could go to newspapers, but newspapers during wartime are patriotic. They don't publish stories that undermine war production. She could go to parent groups, but parent groups have no legal authority. She could... And then she remembers something. A year ago, she attended a regional OPA conference in Seattle. There was a speaker, a woman from the Seattle office named Ruth Eisenberg, who talked about wartime food safety. After the presentation, they had coffee. Ruth mentioned she had connections at the Office of War Information in Washington, D.C., and that WWII sometimes coordinated with the FBI on fraud investigations when military contracts were involved. Margaret finds Ruth's business card, calls the Seattle office. Ruth remembers her. Margaret explains the situation carefully, without names at first, just the pattern. Ruth listens. When Margaret finishes, Ruth is quiet for 10 seconds. Then, "Margaret, what you're describing is conspiracy to defraud the government. If this cannery is delivering contaminated product to civilian institutions while billing the military for quality product, that's a federal crime that bypasses local protection. Send me everything you have. I know someone at OWI who handles fraud cases." July 1943. Margaret sends Ruth a complete package. All laboratory reports, all school health log photographs, all parent testimonies, all correlation charts. Ruth forwards it to her contact at OWI, Special Investigator Arthur Lowell. August 12, 1943. Margaret receives a telegram at the Gresham office. Stop. Request meeting. Portland, August 16th. Federal Building, 10 a.m. Stop. Arthur Lowell, OWI. Stop. Margaret's hands shake as she reads the telegram. OWI. Office of War Information. This is real. This is federal. This bypasses everything. August 16th. Margaret arrives at the Federal Building at 9:45 a.m. She's wearing her best navy suit, her hair carefully set. She carries a briefcase with duplicate copies of all documentation. She's directed to a third-floor conference room. Arthur Lowell is a man of about 45, thin, with steel-rimmed glasses and the focused intensity of someone who doesn't waste time. With him is another man, younger, who introduces himself as FBI Special Agent Thomas Whitmore. FBI. Margaret sits. Lowell speaks. "Mrs. Hendricks, we've reviewed your materials. What you've documented is serious. But before we proceed, I need to understand. Are you prepared for what happens next? This won't be pleasant. You'll be questioned. Your motives will be challenged. You'll be called a troublemaker, maybe worse. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret doesn't hesitate. __quote _36 __. Lowell nods. __quote _37 __. Margaret. __quote _38 __. Whitmore speaks for the first time. 39 thinks. September 1943. Margaret makes a series of careful inquiries. She learns that Columbia River Cannery employs approximately 200 workers: fishermen, processors, canners, warehouse staff, administrative clerks. Most are women because the men are either in the military or working defense jobs. Among the administrative staff is a woman named Helen Kowalski, a filing clerk who's worked there since 1939. Margaret doesn't know Helen personally, but she knows Helen's sister Anna from church. St. Stanislaus Catholic Church on Interstate Avenue. Polish community. Tight-knit. Margaret approaches Anna carefully after Sunday Mass in late September. Says she needs to speak privately. They sit in a quiet pew after the crowd disperses. Margaret explains the situation. Not all of it, but enough. Children being poisoned. Evidence of fraud. Need for inside help. Anna listens. When Margaret finishes, Anna says, "Helen hates that place. She hates Bradshaw. He treats the girls like dirt, yells at them, docks their pay for the smallest things. But she needs the job. Her husband's in the Pacific. She has 2 kids. What are you asking her to do?" Margaret, just copy documents, purchase orders, shipping manifests, internal memos, anything that shows where the good product goes versus the bad product. Anna, that's dangerous. If Bradshaw finds out, he'll fire her. Maybe worse. Margaret, I know, but children are dying. A boy died in March, 6 years old, acute poisoning from Bradshaw's salmon. His name was Peter Sullivan, Jefferson Elementary. I have the medical examiner's report. Anna closes her eyes. I'll talk to Helen. No promises. October 1943. Helen Kowalski agrees to help. Not enthusiastically, not fearlessly, but with the grim determination of someone who's seen too much and can't stay silent anymore. She works in the administrative office at Columbia River Cannery, filing shipping documents, processing orders, typing correspondence. She has access to the file room. She starts making copies of key documents after hours when the office is empty. She uses the photostat machine, slow, noisy, but effective. Each night she copies 3 or 4 pages, hides them in her purse, takes them home. Every week she meets Margaret at St. Stanislaus Church, hands over the documents. Margaret photographs them with her Brownie camera, returns the originals. Helen puts them back in the files the next day. It's terrifying work. Every noise makes Helen jump. Every time Bradshaw walks past the file room, her heart pounds. But she keeps going. By December 1943, Helen has provided copies of 73 documents. Margaret has photographed all of them. The evidence is devastating. Purchase orders showing Columbia River Cannery buying grade A salmon at premium prices, then shipping that product to private buyers in San Francisco and Los Angeles at black market rates, double the official OPA ceiling prices. Internal memos from Bradshaw to his warehouse manager. __quote _46 __. Shipping manifests showing identical product lots going to 2 destinations. Military bases receiving cans marked __quote _47 _. Schools receiving cans from the same lots marked __quote _48 _. But the actual contents reversed. Financial records showing Bradshaw personally pocketing over $40,000 in black market profits between July 1942 and November 1943. This isn't just food safety negligence. This is organized fraud, black market profiteering, and knowing endangerment of children, all during wartime. December 15, 1943. Margaret meets with Lowell and Whitmore again, hands over the complete photographic documentation. Lowell and Whitmore review it in silence. Finally, Lowell looks up. "Mrs. Hendricks, this is extraordinary work. This is enough for indictment." Whitmore adds, "We move fast now. Grand jury next month. If they indict, we arrest Bradshaw and shut down the cannery. Are you ready?" Margaret, "I'm ready." January 1944. The grand jury convenes in Portland. Margaret testifies for 4 hours. She presents laboratory evidence, school health records, parent testimonies, photographic documentation of internal cannery records. She explains the correlation between deliveries and illness outbreaks. She presents the financial evidence of black market sales. The grand jury deliberates for 2 hours. They return with indictments. Vernon L. Bradshaw, conspiracy to defraud the United States, violation of the Emergency Price Control Act, black market profiteering, reckless endangerment. 3 warehouse managers. Conspiracy, falsification of documents. The cannery bookkeeper, conspiracy, fraud. January 28, 1944. FBI agents arrest Vernon Bradshaw at his home in Laurelhurst at 6 a.m. Simultaneous raids on the cannery, the warehouse, and the homes of co-conspirators. Seizure of all records, all product inventory, all financial documents. Margaret learns about the arrests from a morning radio news bulletin. She sits in her apartment, listening. Howard is getting ready for his shipyard shift. He hears the news, looks at Margaret. "Isn't that the cannery you were investigating?" Margaret nods. Howard stares at her. "Maggie, did you do this?" Margaret meets his eyes. "Yes." Howard sits down heavily. "My God, you actually did it." The trial begins in April 1944. Federal Courthouse, downtown Portland, U.S. District Court. Judge Herbert Langston presiding. Prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Douglas Brenner, brought in from the Justice Department's Fraud Division specifically for this case. The trial lasts 3 weeks. Margaret is the prosecution's star witness. She testifies for 2 full days. The defense attorney, a high-priced lawyer from San Francisco named Clayton Marsh, tries to discredit her. Calls her obsessive, vindictive, emotionally unstable. Implies she fabricated evidence to settle a personal grudge. But Margaret doesn't break. She stays calm. She presents facts, laboratory reports, photographs, statistical analysis, chain of custody documentation. Every question Marsh asks, she answers with precision. The school nurses testify. They bring health logs. They describe children crying in pain, vomiting, collapsing. Helen Kowalski testifies. She describes what she witnessed inside the cannery. Spoiled fish being processed, false labeling, Bradshaw's orders to move contaminated product into school shipment lots. Parents testify. They describe their children's suffering. One mother, Catherine Sullivan, mother of Peter Sullivan, the 6-year-old who died, takes the stand. She's composed until the prosecutor asks her to describe her son. Then she breaks down. The courtroom is silent except for her sobbing. The defense tries to argue that no definitive link exists between the cannery's product and the illnesses. They bring their own expert witness, a food scientist from California, who testifies that the bacterial levels found by Margaret could have occurred after the cans were opened, due to improper storage at the schools. But the prosecution brings in a Navy medical officer who inspected the same lot numbers at a military base in California. He testifies, _quote_56__. The financial evidence is irrefutable. Bradshaw's personal bank records show deposits matching black market sale amounts. Purchase orders show the price manipulation scheme. The numbers don't lie. On May 3, 1944, the jury begins deliberations. They deliberate for 11 hours. At 4 p.m. on May 4th, they return. Guilty on all counts. Vernon Bradshaw stands stone-faced as the verdict is read. His lawyer immediately files notice of appeal. But everyone in the courtroom knows he's finished. Sentencing is set for June 15th. Judge Langston doesn't mess around. __quote_57__. 15 years. Margaret sits in the courtroom gallery, watching as marshals take Bradshaw into custody. He looks around the room once before they lead him away. His eyes find Margaret. He stares at her. She stares back. No expression, just cold certainty. Then, he's gone. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarm Margaret. She gives a brief statement. Justice has been served. Children are safer today than they were yesterday. That's all that matters. That evening, Howard and Margaret sit in their apartment. Howard pours 2 glasses of whiskey, rare, expensive, saved for special occasions. He hands one to Margaret. You did it. You actually brought down Vernon Bradshaw. Margaret sips the whiskey. We did it. Lowell, Whitmore, Ruth, Helen, all the parents, all the nurses. It wasn't just me. Howard shakes his head. No, Maggie, it started with you. You could have stayed quiet. You were transferred, reprimanded, told to shut up. You didn't. Why? Margaret thinks about Peter Sullivan, 6 years old, dead from contaminated salmon. She thinks about the 412 other children who got sick. She thinks about the children who won't get sick now because Bradshaw is in prison. Quote 62 _, she says simply. But the cost becomes apparent over the following months. June 1944. Margaret returns to work at the Gresham office. Agnes Crowley treats her differently now, warily, respectfully, but with distance. Margaret is no longer just a transferred inspector. She's the woman who brought down Vernon Bradshaw. That makes her dangerous. Not in a bad way, but dangerous nonetheless. Someone who doesn't accept corruption, doesn't play the game, doesn't stay quiet. Other inspectors respect her, but they also keep distance, because associating with Margaret means accepting that standard isn't good enough. It means accepting responsibility to act when you see wrongdoing. Most people don't want that responsibility. July 1944. Howard comes home from the shipyard one evening and sits Margaret down. Quote 63 _. His tone is serious. Margaret's heart sinks. She knows what's coming. Howard says. He pauses. Margaret looks at him, sees the hope in his eyes, the anticipation of her saying yes, of them moving together, of starting fresh somewhere new. But she also sees the unspoken question beneath. Can we leave this behind? Can you leave this behind? Quote 67 _, she says carefully. Quote 68 _. Howard doesn't answer immediately. Then, both. Yes, it's a good opportunity. But also, Maggie, you've changed. Since this whole Bradshaw thing started, you're different. You're harder, more distant. I feel like I don't know you anymore. Margaret feels the words like a physical blow. I'm the same person I've always been. No, Howard says quietly. You're not. The Maggie I married wanted a simple life, family, stability, peace. This Maggie goes to war, and I don't know if I can live with that version of you. The silence stretches between them. Finally, Margaret says, I can't go to San Diego. My work is here. Howard nods slowly. I thought you'd say that. He stands up. I'm taking the job, Maggie, with or without you. I leave in 3 weeks. August 1944. Howard moves to San Diego. Margaret stays in Portland. They don't file for divorce immediately. That comes later, in 1946. But the marriage is effectively over. Margaret keeps the apartment. Howard sends money every month at first, then eventually stops. Margaret continues working. She gets promoted to senior inspector in September 1944, a recognition of her work on the Bradshaw case. She's assigned back to downtown Portland, no longer Gresham, no longer exile. But the professional success doesn't fill the personal void. September 1944. Margaret receives a letter from Helen Kowalski. Helen left Columbia River Cannery after the trial. The place shut down after Bradshaw's conviction, reorganized under new management, renamed Pacific Coast Fisheries. Helen found work as a secretary at a law firm. She writes, Dear Margaret, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. I know it cost you. I heard about you and Howard. I'm sorry. But I want you to know, my kids are healthy. My sister Anna's kids are healthy. The kids at Jefferson Elementary are healthy. Because of you. That has to count for something. You're a hero, even if nobody calls you that. Sincerely, Helen. Margaret folds the letter carefully, puts it in a drawer. Hero. She doesn't feel like a hero. She feels like someone who did what had to be done and paid the price. October 1944. Margaret attends a memorial service at Jefferson Elementary. The school installed a plaque in memory of Peter Sullivan. __, quote, _, 77 ___. Margaret stands in front of the plaque. Peter's mother, Catherine Sullivan, is there. She sees Margaret, approaches. For a moment, Margaret fears anger. Why didn't you act sooner? Why didn't you save my son? But Catherine embraces her, whispers, "Thank you. You made sure no other mother goes through what I went through. Thank you." Margaret holds Catherine Sullivan and cries for the first time since the trial ended. All the grief, all the exhaustion, all the loneliness, it pours out. When they finally separate, Catherine looks at Margaret with red-rimmed eyes. "You gave up everything for this, didn't you?" Margaret nods. Catherine, "Was it worth it?" Margaret looks at the plaque, Peter Sullivan's name engraved in bronze. Then looks around the schoolyard, where children are playing, healthy and laughing. __, quote, _81 __, Margaret says. __, quote, _82 __, November 1944. Margaret is reassigned to lead a new OPA task force focused on wartime food safety violations. It's a promotion, recognition from Washington that she's someone who gets results. She throws herself into the work, inspects canneries up and down the Oregon coast, finds violations, reports them. Most are minor, addressed with compliance orders. None approach the scale of Bradshaw's operation. December 1944. Christmas. Margaret spends it alone in her apartment. She puts up a small tree, makes dinner for one, listens to carols on the radio, thinks about Howard in San Diego, probably celebrating with new friends, new colleagues. Thinks about the Christmases they spent together. Just 3, but they seemed like the foundation of a future. That future is gone now. But as she sits alone, she receives visitors. Ruth Eisenberg from Seattle, passing through Portland, stops by with a bottle of wine. They talk for hours about the war, about food safety work, about the challenges of being professional women in a man's world. Agnes Crowley, Margaret's former supervisor, sends a card. "You were right. I should have supported you. I'm sorry I didn't. Merry Christmas." And Helen Kowalski sends a package, homemade Polish cookies, a hand-knitted scarf, and a note. "For the woman who gave my children a future. Merry Christmas, Margaret. You're not alone." Margaret realizes she's built something different from what she planned. Not a traditional family, but a network of women who fought together, who stood up when it mattered, who refused to accept corruption as inevitable. January 1945. Margaret turns 29. Her friends from the OPA, Ruth, Agnes, and 2 other inspectors, Linda Morrison and Grace Yamamoto, take her to dinner at Jake's Famous Crawfish. They toast to her birthday, to her courage, to the end of the war that everyone can feel coming. Grace Yamamoto, a Japanese-American woman who spent 1942 to 1943 in the Minidoka internment camp before being released to work for the OPA, raises her glass. To Margaret Hendricks, the stubbornest woman in Oregon. May she continue making corrupt men very, very nervous. They all laugh. Margaret smiles. It's real, genuine laughter, something she hasn't felt in months. February 1945. Margaret receives a letter from the Justice Department. They're expanding investigation into wartime fraud cases across the Pacific Northwest. They want her to consult as an expert witness on 3 additional cases. She agrees. Over the next year, she helps prosecute two more significant cases. A Seattle meatpacker who was mixing horse meat into ground beef sold to military bases, and a fish processor in Astoria running a ration coupon counterfeiting operation. Both cases end in convictions. Margaret becomes known in federal law enforcement circles as someone who builds airtight cases. Meticulous, thorough, unstoppable. August 1945. The war ends. VJ Day. Portland celebrates. Margaret joins the crowds downtown, watches the celebration, feels the relief and joy. But she also feels the weight of transition. What happens now? The OPA will likely be dismantled. Wartime regulations will end. What happens to inspectors like her? December 1945. The OPA begins downsizing. Margaret receives notice that her position will be eliminated in March 1946. She's offered a transfer to the Department of Agriculture, Permanent Civil Service, Food Safety Inspection role. She accepts. January 1946. Margaret files for divorce from Howard. It's uncontested. Howard has remarried already, a woman he met in San Diego, a secretary at the Navy Yard. Margaret signs the papers without bitterness. Their marriage ended long before the legal paperwork. March 1946. Margaret starts her new position with the Department of Agriculture. Different office, different title, but the same essential work: ensuring food safety, catching violators, protecting public health. She's assigned to oversee inspections across Oregon and Washington. It's a senior role, supervisory, with real authority. April 1946. Margaret learns that Vernon Bradshaw, serving his sentence at McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in Washington, has filed another appeal. It's his third. All previous appeals were denied. This one will be too. But he keeps trying. Margaret receives a letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office asking if she'd be willing to provide additional testimony if needed. She writes back, "Always." May 1946. Margaret visits McNeil Island as part of a federal food safety inspection. The prison operates its own food service, subject to USDA oversight. While there, she learns that Bradshaw works in the prison laundry. She doesn't seek him out. Doesn't need to see him. Knowing he's there, serving his sentence is enough. But as she's leaving the prison, she passes through the administration building, and there, in a hallway, she sees him. Bradshaw, now 51 years old, in prison blues, escorted by a guard. 2 years of confinement have taken their toll. His shoulders are hunched, his face lined with new creases. But he's recognizable. He sees her, stops. The guard stops too, confused. Bradshaw stares at Margaret. She stares back. Neither speaks. The moment stretches. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Finally, Bradshaw says, __quote _87 __. Margaret's response is immediate, cold, certain. No, you destroyed your life. I just made sure you faced consequences. The guard pulls Bradshaw away. Margaret walks out of the prison, doesn't look back. June 1946. Margaret receives a letter from Jefferson Elementary School. They're dedicating a new science lab in Peter Sullivan's name, funded by part of the restitution money Bradshaw was ordered to pay. They invite Margaret to the dedication ceremony. She attends, speaks briefly, says, quote, "The audience applauds. Catherine Sullivan embraces Margaret afterward, whispers, quote. Margaret holds her, says nothing, because there's nothing to say that makes it better. September 1946. Margaret settles into her new role. She's good at it. Inspections, compliance, enforcement. She builds a reputation, fair but uncompromising. Inspectors respect her. Violators fear her. Industry lobbyists try to get her removed. She's too strict, too inflexible. But her record is too good. The Department of Agriculture keeps her. December 1946. Another Christmas alone. But this year, Margaret hosts dinner for her friends. Ruth, Agnes, Helen, Linda, Grace. 5 women, all of whom fought different battles, all of whom refused to accept corruption. They eat, drink, laugh, share stories. It's not traditional family, but it's community. It's solidarity. It's enough. January 1947. Margaret turns 31. 4 years since the Bradshaw investigation began. She reflects on what's changed. She's divorced, alone, living in a 1-bedroom apartment. No children, no husband, no conventional success. But she has integrity, purpose, the knowledge that 412 children who got sick recovered, the knowledge that countless others were protected because Bradshaw went to prison, the knowledge that the system, corrupt, powerful, entrenched, can be challenged, can be beaten. Was it worth the cost? The answer comes not immediately, but when it comes, it's clear. Yes. Worth it. Because Peter Sullivan shouldn't have died, and hundreds of other children shouldn't have suffered. And Bradshaw should have faced justice. February 1947. Margaret receives notice that Bradshaw's latest appeal has been denied. Final denial. No more legal options. He'll serve his full sentence, 15 years, with possibility of parole after 10. March 1947. Margaret visits Jefferson Elementary on the anniversary of her first report on contaminated salmon. 4 years. She stands in front of Peter Sullivan's memorial plaque, watches children play in the schoolyard. Healthy, laughing, safe. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, approaches her. "Are you the lady who helped us?" Margaret is startled. "What?" The girl. "My teacher said a lady made sure our food was safe. Are you her?" Margaret kneels down. "How do you know about that?" The girl. "Mrs. Peterson told us. She said we should always tell the truth, even when it's hard, because that's what brave people do." Margaret smiles. "Your teacher is right." The girl. "Are you brave?" Margaret thinks about it. "I try to be." The girl nods seriously. "Okay, thank you." Then she runs back to the playground. Margaret stands, watches her go. Thinks, that's why. That little girl. All the little girls and boys who are safe because someone stood up. April 1947. Margaret receives a letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're compiling a report on successful wartime fraud prosecutions for the Justice Department. The Bradshaw case is featured as a model investigation. They credit Margaret's work as instrumental. Ask permission to use her name. She grants it. May 1947. The report is published. Margaret receives a copy. On page 47, there's a case study. __quote _100 ___. The summary describes her initial investigation, her persistence despite bureaucratic resistance, her collaboration with federal authorities. It concludes, __quote _101 ___. Margaret reads it twice, then files it away. It's acknowledgement, validation, but it doesn't change what she already knows. She did the right thing. June 1947. Margaret is promoted again. Now she's Regional Director of Food Safety for the Pacific Northwest, supervises 30 inspectors across Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. It's a big job. She's only 31, youngest regional director in the Department of Agriculture. The appointment causes controversy. Industry groups protest. She's too aggressive, too uncompromising. They want someone more __quote _102 __. The Department of Agriculture's response. Mrs. Hendricks has the best prosecution record in the country. She stays. July 1947. Margaret establishes new protocols for food safety inspection in her region. More frequent spot checks, mandatory testing of all canned goods, Surprise inspections. Zero tolerance for labeling violations. The protocols are strict. Industry complains. But contamination cases drop by 60% in the first year. August 1947. Margaret receives an invitation to speak at a national conference on food safety in Washington, D.C. Topic: Effective investigation and prosecution of food safety violations. She accepts. Prepares a presentation based on the Bradshaw case. Delivers it to an audience of 200 federal and state food safety officials. The response is overwhelming. Questions for an hour after her presentation. Other inspectors want to know: how did you overcome bureaucratic resistance? How did you build your case? How did you keep going when everyone told you to stop? Margaret's answer: quote, _105 September 1947. Margaret returns to Portland. Back to work. Inspections, reports, enforcement actions. The routine of bureaucracy. But now she understands. Bureaucracy isn't inherently corrupt. It's just a system. Systems can be used for good or evil. Depends on the people operating them. She's determined to operate hers for good. October 1947. Margaret learns that Vernon Bradshaw has been transferred from McNeil Island to a federal prison in California. Part of routine redistribution. She doesn't care where he is, as long as he's in prison. November 1947. Margaret receives a letter from Helen Kowalski. Helen's husband returned from the Pacific. War's over. He's home. They're rebuilding their lives. Helen writes, "Margaret, I wanted you to know. John knows what I did. Copying those files, risking everything. I told him everything. And he said I did the right thing. He said he fought in the Pacific to protect people like my kids from people like Bradshaw. He said you're a hero. I think so too." Margaret folds the letter, puts it with the others, Catherine Sullivan's, Ruth Eisenberg's, Grace Yamamoto's. A collection of voices saying, "You did right. It matters." December 1947, 5th Christmas since the investigation began. Margaret hosts dinner again. This year, 10 women attend, inspectors, nurses, former colleagues. They formed an informal network, women in public service who support each other, who refuse to tolerate corruption, who do the hard work of keeping institutions honest. They call themselves, jokingly, Margaret's Army. Margaret protests the name. They ignore her. "You started this," Ruth says. "Own it." January 1948. Margaret turns 32, reflects on the past 5 years. Everything that's changed. Everything that's been lost. Everything that's been gained. Lost. Marriage. Conventional life. The illusion of simple happiness. Gained. Integrity. Purpose. The knowledge that justice is possible even when the system resists. Worth it? Yes. Always yes. Because somewhere in Portland, children are eating lunch at school. Safe lunch. Uncontaminated lunch. Lunch that won't poison them. Because Vernon Bradshaw is in prison. Because the next Vernon Bradshaw will think twice before poisoning children for profit. That's victory. Small, specific, real. And Margaret Hendricks sleeps soundly at night. February 1948. Margaret visits Jefferson Elementary again. Stands in front of Peter Sullivan's memorial. A teacher sees her, recognizes her, approaches. "Mrs. Hendricks? I'm Mrs. Peterson. I teach 3rd grade. I tell my students about you, about doing the right thing even when it's difficult." Margaret: "I just did my job." Mrs. Peterson shakes her head. "No, you did more than your job. You gave these children safety. You gave us justice. That's not just a job. That's a calling." Margaret doesn't know how to respond to that. So she just says, quote, _113 March 1948. 5 years since that first contamination report. Margaret sits in her office, reviews inspection protocols, signs off on enforcement actions. The work continues. Will always continue. Because corruption is persistent, vigilance must be too. But sometimes, late at night, Margaret takes out that old composition notebook, the one where she first recorded the pattern of deliveries and illnesses, flips through pages, each entry a piece of evidence, each date a step toward justice, and smiles. The same smile she gave Bradshaw in the prison hallway. The smile of someone who knows justice is possible, even when you're alone. Even when the system protects the powerful, even when the odds are impossible. You just have to refuse to quit, refuse to compromise, refuse to accept that wrong is inevitable. Margaret Hendricks refused, and won. And somewhere in a California federal prison, Vernon Bradshaw lies on his bunk and stares at the ceiling. He's 53 years old, 11 more years until parole eligibility. 4 years served already. Every day, he thinks about that food inspector, Margaret Hendricks. Navy suit, determined eyes, unbreakable will. He underestimated her, thought she was nobody, just another bureaucrat who'd file a report and move on. He was wrong. And that's the most humiliating part. Not that he's in prison, but that he was destroyed by someone he never considered a threat, someone he dismissed as powerless. She had no power, no connections, no protection. But she had something more dangerous, refusal to be silenced. And that destroyed him. April 1948. Margaret walks through downtown Portland. Spring has come early, cherry blossoms blooming, sun warm, children playing in parks, mothers pushing strollers, life continuing. She stops, watches a mother and daughter at a hot dog cart. The girl, maybe 8, laughs as her mother buys her lunch. They sit on a bench, eat together, talk. Normal, safe, ordinary. That's what Margaret fought for. Not glory, not recognition, not even justice in the abstract. Just this: mothers and daughters having lunch together, children eating safely, ordinary life, uncontaminated. She fought for the ordinary, the basic, the foundational right of children to eat without being poisoned. And she won. Margaret smiles, adjusts her briefcase, continues walking, back to the office, back to inspections, reports, enforcement, back to the work. But now she knows, one person can make a difference, even against systemic corruption, even alone, even when the cost is everything. You just have to be willing to pay the price. Margaret Hendricks paid, and she doesn't regret it, not for one single day. May 1948. Margaret receives an unexpected visitor at her Department of Agriculture office. A young woman, 22 or 23, wearing a business suit and carrying a leather portfolio. She introduces herself as Evelyn Marsh, recently graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in food science. She's applying for an inspector position. Evelyn says nervously. Margaret looks at this young woman, earnest, idealistic, probably naive about how hard the work actually is. She sees herself 5 years ago, before the Bradshaw case, before she understood what justice actually costs. She could discourage her, could tell her the truth. This work will consume you, will cost you relationships, will make you unpopular, will leave you alone. But she doesn't. Instead, Margaret says, the work is harder than any textbook describes. You'll face resistance. You'll be told to look the other way. You'll lose friends, maybe more. Are you prepared for that? Evelyn doesn't hesitate. quote 117 __. Margaret smiles, recognizes that certainty, that refusal to be discouraged, that stubborn insistence on doing right. Margaret says. Evelyn's face lights up. Thank you, Mrs. Hendricks. You won't regret this. Margaret thinks, maybe I will. Maybe you'll crack under pressure, quit when it gets hard, decide it's not worth the cost. But maybe you won't. Maybe you'll be someone who stands when others fall. Maybe you'll be the next person who refuses to accept corruption. June 1948. Evelyn Marsh begins work as a junior inspector under Margaret's supervision. Margaret trains her personally, shows her how to conduct proper sampling, how to document chain of custody, how to write reports that will hold up in court, how to spot patterns in data, how to build a case brick by brick. Evelyn is a quick learner, diligent, thorough, asks good questions, takes notes constantly. One afternoon, they're inspecting a fish processing plant in Astoria. The plant manager is cooperative, shows them everything, answers every question. The facility appears clean, well-maintained, properly managed. But Margaret notices something. A discrepancy in the refrigeration logs. Temperatures dropping below optimal range for 3 hours on 2 different nights last week. She points it out to the manager. He laughs it off. __quote 121 __. Margaret doesn't laugh. Show me the product that was in storage during those temperature failures. The manager's smile fades. __quote 123 __quote 124 __. Margaret repeats. He does. Margaret takes samples. Later, laboratory analysis shows early-stage bacterial growth. Not enough to make people acutely ill, but enough to cause problems with extended storage. Margaret issues a compliance order. The entire affected lot must be destroyed. The manager protests. __quote 125 __. Margaret. __quote 126 __. The manager complies, grudgingly. Afterward, driving back to Portland, Evelyn asks, __quote 127 __. Margaret glances at her. __quote 128 __. Evelyn nods slowly. __quote 129 __. Margaret hopes she does, because that's the line that separates good inspectors from great ones, refusing to rationalize, refusing to accept probably safe when the standard says definitely safe. August 1948. Margaret receives an invitation to speak at Oregon State University, her alma mater. The Food Science Department wants her to address graduating students. She accepts. Standing at the podium in front of 150 young people about to enter the field, Margaret feels the weight of what she's supposed to say. Inspire them, motivate them, prepare them. She speaks for 30 minutes, tells them about the Bradshaw case, doesn't sugarcoat it, describes the resistance she faced, the personal cost, the loneliness, the difficulty, but also describes the victory, the conviction, the children saved, the knowledge that she did right. She concludes, "You're entering a field that seems technical, bureaucratic, boring. Testing food samples, writing reports, checking refrigeration logs. It doesn't seem heroic. But sometimes, in this boring, technical work, you'll find something wrong, and you'll have a choice. Report it or ignore it. Document it or rationalize it. Push forward or back down. That choice will define who you are, not as a food scientist, as a person. Choose integrity, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. Because on the other side of your reports, your inspections, your enforcement actions, There are children, real children, who deserve adults willing to protect them. Be that adult. The applause is long and loud. Afterward, a dozen students line up to speak with her, ask questions, request advice, thank her. One young man, maybe 21, says, "Mrs. Hendricks, I have to tell you, I was planning to go into private industry, better pay, easier work. But after hearing you speak, I think I want to be an inspector. Is that crazy?" Margaret smiles. "No, it's not crazy. It's the hardest path, but also the most important one. We need good people in this work. If you're committed, we'd be lucky to have you." October 1948. Helen Kowalski visits Margaret's office. Helen's children are now 8 and 10 years old, healthy, thriving, doing well in school. Helen brings Margaret a gift, a framed photograph of her 2 kids, smiling, holding fishing rods at a lake. "I wanted you to have this," Helen says. "These are the children you saved. Not just mine, all of them. Everyone who would have eaten Bradshaw's poison if you hadn't stopped him. I want you to remember, this is what your sacrifice bought. Happy children, safe children, living children." Margaret accepts the photograph, doesn't know what to say. Finally, quote 137 __. After Helen leaves, Margaret places the photograph on her desk, next to the memorial service program from Peter Sullivan's funeral, a reminder of what was lost and what was saved. April 1949. Margaret receives a call from Evelyn Marsh, her protégé. Evelyn has found something suspicious at a dairy processing plant in Salem. Inconsistent pasteurization records. Product potentially shipped without proper heat treatment. Risk of bacterial contamination. Evelyn is nervous. "Mrs. Hendricks, the plant manager is connected politically. His brother-in-law is on the state agricultural board. If I push this, there could be blowback. What should I do?" Margaret doesn't hesitate. Evelyn, Margaret. Silence on the line. Then, Margaret. 2 months later, the dairy plant manager is indicted for violating pasteurization standards. Evelyn's evidence is solid. The case goes to trial. Conviction, fine, and probation. It's not as dramatic as the Bradshaw case. No children died. No massive fraud operation. Just one plant manager cutting corners, risking public health for marginal profit increases. But it matters. Because every case matters. Every enforcement action matters. Every time someone stands up and says, quote 144 __, it matters. Evelyn learns this lesson, becomes a better inspector for it. Will probably someday train her own protégés. Pass on the lesson. Integrity matters. Standing up matters. Fighting matters. The work continues, generation to generation, inspector to inspector, from Margaret to Evelyn to whoever comes next. September 1949. Margaret stands in her office, looking at the photograph Helen gave her. 2 smiling children with fishing rods. Living children. Safe children. This is why. This is always why. Not for medals, not for recognition, not for career advancement. For this. For children who get to grow up, who get to smile, who get to be safe. Margaret Hendricks fought for them. Fights for them still. Will fight for them as long as she draws breath. Because that's what justice requires. Not grand gestures, not dramatic confrontations, just steady, persistent, unglamorous work. Day after day, case after case, inspection after inspection. Standing up when others sit down, speaking when others stay silent, fighting when others surrender. One person, against a corrupt system, against powerful interests, against impossible odds. One person who refused to quit. That's enough to change everything. Margaret Hendricks proved it, and she'll prove it again and again, for as long as it takes. Because justice isn't a single victory, it's a lifetime of battles. Some large, some small, some that make headlines, most that don't. But all of them matter, every single one. She's ready for whatever comes next, for the next Bradshaw, for the next fight. And she's not alone, because she's built an army. Women like Evelyn, Ruth, Helen, Grace, Agnes. Women who stand for integrity, who refuse to compromise, who do the hard work. They're out there, in Seattle and Salem and Astoria and Portland, in cities and towns across America. Women who test food, inspect facilities, enforce standards, build cases. Quiet heroes, unsung protectors, guardians of children they'll never meet. Margaret leads them, not by commanding, but by example, by showing what's possible when you refuse to quit. That's her legacy, not just the Bradshaw case, but the culture she's building, the standard she's setting, the next generation she's training. That's what will outlast her. Long after she retires, long after she's gone, that culture will remain. Inspectors will train their own protégés. Who will train theirs? Generation after generation, each learning the lesson. Integrity matters. Standing up matters. Fighting matters. That's victory. Real, lasting, permanent victory. Not defeating one corrupt cannery manager, but creating a system where corruption becomes harder, where people like Bradshaw face real consequences, where inspectors know they'll be supported when they do right. Margaret built that. Brick by brick, case by case, fight by fight. And it's beautiful. In its own unglamorous way. Beautiful, necessary, and true. Margaret Hendricks picks up her briefcase, heads out for another inspection. Another day of work. Another brick in the foundation of justice. This is her life. Not the life she planned, but the life she chose. The life she earned. The life that matters. And she wouldn't trade it for anything.